The tea had gone cold again. I noticed it the way I noticed most things in that house by then. Quietly, without saying a word, setting the cup back on its saucer and folding my hands in my lap as though nothing had happened. As though a cup of cold tea were simply the temperature at which tea was meant to be served to a woman like me. A woman who had lived in that house for 31 years, who had painted every wall, planted every rosebush along the front walk, who had held her dying husband's hand in the bedroom at the end of the hall and promised him she would be all right. I was 71 years old. I had been a pharmacist for 34 years. I had compounded medications, counseled patients, caught dosing errors that could have killed people. I had read ingredient labels and drug interaction charts the way other people read novels, hungrily, carefully, never skimming. I knew what things were made of. I knew what they did to the human body. I knew what too much of something looked like, and I knew what not enough looked like. And I knew the particular silence of a person who was adding something to your food and hoping you would not notice. I noticed. I want to be clear about that from the beginning, because the story I am about to tell you is not a story about a foolish old woman who was tricked. It is a story about a woman who saw exactly what was happening and chose, very deliberately, very carefully, not to let on that she saw. My name is Miriam Voss. I live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. In the house my husband Gerald and I bought in 1993 when the neighborhood still had oak trees lining both sides of the street, and the man next door kept a garden that smelled of tomatoes every summer. Gerald passed away 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. Quick and merciless the way it always is. He was gone in 7 months from diagnosis, and I spent the first year after wondering how a person was supposed to get used to silence that large. My son Marcus was my only child. He had his father's eyes and his father's broad shoulders, and for a long time he had his father's sense of humor too, dry and fond and full of private jokes that made you feel like you were being let in on something. I loved Marcus in the way only mothers love sons, which is to say completely and unwisely, and with a blind spot the size of a continent. He married Candace 7 years ago. She was a project manager at a logistics firm, organized and capable in the way of someone who had decided early in life that efficiency was the highest virtue. She was not warm exactly, but I did not expect warmth. I expected respect. I expected a daughter I could learn to love. I expected to be wrong about my first impressions. I was not wrong. But I am getting ahead of myself. The arrangement that brought us all under one roof began 2 years ago, in the autumn, when Marcus called me on a Sunday evening and explained, in his careful, slightly rehearsed way, that he and Candace had been doing some thinking. The commute was long for both of them. The house was large. And here he paused in the way he always paused when he was about to say something he knew I would not like. I was getting older, and it would be better for everyone if I were not alone. Better for everyone, I repeated. Better for you, Mom. Safer. I had just that week driven to my doctor's appointment, stopped at the pharmacy to review a colleague's questionable compound for a home patient, met a friend for lunch, and repaired the leaking valve under the kitchen sink myself. I was not struggling. But Marcus was my son, and he was using the voice he used when he was worried, and I told him yes. I told him, of course. I told him to bring Candace and come home. They arrived in November. Candace supervised the movers. She had opinions about where the furniture should go, and I let her voice them, and I agreed with most of them, and I told myself this was how it worked when 2 households became one. You gave a little. You made room. I made a great deal of room. By January, I had moved my reading chair from the living room because Candace found it visually heavy. By February, I had stopped using the kitchen between 4 and 7 in the evenings because that was when Candace cooked dinner, and she found it disruptive to have someone else in the space. By March, I was eating my breakfast after they left for work because the mornings, it turned out, were also a kind of disruption. I told myself these were small adjustments. I told myself I was being flexible, which is what you tell yourself when what is actually happening is that you are disappearing. I should tell you about the dinners. Candace cooked dinner most evenings. She was a good cook, precise and consistent the way she was precise and consistent about everything. She made the kind of meals that looked impressive without being particularly interesting. Salmon with herb crusts, chicken with reductions, grain bowls with 7 components arranged by color. She did not ask whether I liked these things. She informed me pleasantly when dinner was ready. I came to the table. I ate what was put in front of me and said it was lovely, which it was, and said thank you, which I meant, and then I excused myself and went to my room and sometimes stood at the window for a long time thinking about Gerald and how different supper used to feel. Marcus during this period was working long hours. He was traveling frequently for work, Atlanta one week, Chicago the next. And in his absence, the house had a particular quality I can only describe as held breath. Candace was pleasant to me. Perfectly pleasant. Efficiently pleasant, in the way of someone who has decided that pleasantness is a strategy rather than a feeling. She asked after my health with the frequency of someone who had noted it in a planner. She reminded me about my medications with the tone of someone who was not entirely certain I was capable of remembering them myself. Once, when I mentioned that I had been in contact with my former colleague at the pharmacy about a consulting question, she nodded in the way people nod when they are storing information away for later use, and then she said, "That must be nice to stay connected to the work." Even now, I was 71. I was not ancient. I was not diminished. But I heard the subtext in those two words as clearly as I would have heard a wrong note in a familiar song, and I filed it away. I was paying attention. I want you to understand that. I had been paying attention for a very long time. The first thing I noticed was the tea. Candace had begun making me a cup of herbal tea every evening around 8 o'clock. It was not something I had asked for. It arrived one evening simply already made, set on the table beside my chair, with a brief explanation that she had read herbal teas were helpful for sleep in older adults. I thanked her. I drank it. I slept deeply that night, which I noted, and then pushed aside. The second night she brought it again. The third night. By the end of the first week, it was part of the evening's rhythm. Dinner, washing up, the tea appearing on my side table without comment, like a small ritual. I slept heavily those nights. Deeply. In a way that felt less like rest and more like submersion. I woke each morning slightly fogged, with a quality of grogginess I had not experienced before. I attributed it, for the first 2 weeks, to the winter air, to the adjustment of living with other people, to the ordinary vagaries of aging. I drank the tea. I slept. I woke foggy. And then, on a Tuesday in late January, Marcus came home early from a trip that had been cut short. He found me at the kitchen table at 11 in the morning, still in my robe, a half-finished cup of coffee in front of me and a crossword puzzle I had made no progress on. He looked at me with an expression I did not recognize at first, and then I did recognize it. It was concern sharpened by something else, something carefully controlled. "Mom," he said. "How are you feeling?" "Fine," I said. "A little slow this morning." He sat down across from me and we talked for a while about nothing in particular, and then he went upstairs and I heard him and Candace speaking in low voices, and I could not make out the words but I could make out the rhythm of the conversation. I knew that rhythm. I had sat in enough IEP meetings and family consultations to know the rhythm of two people deciding something about a third person who is not in the room. That was when I began to suspect. I want to be precise about what I mean by suspect. I did not jump to conclusions. I am not a person who jumps to conclusions. I am a person who gathers information and weighs it carefully and draws conclusions only when the evidence is sufficient to support them. I had spent 34 years being that kind of person. It did not occur to me to be any other kind now. So I began to observe. I began to keep notes, not on paper where they might be found, but in the notebook application on my phone, time-stamped and precise. I noted the quality of my sleep. I noted the mornings when I felt foggy and the mornings when I felt clear. And I began to notice, with the particular satisfaction of someone who has found a pattern, that the foggy mornings always followed evenings when I had drunk the tea. I noted what I could about the tea itself, the smell of it, which was pleasant and herbal with an undertone I found slightly floral, slightly bitter, and impossible to place exactly. Candace used a blend she kept in a small tin on the second shelf of the pantry, and the tin was unlabeled. I noted this also. Then I began to do what I had done for 34 years. I researched. The symptoms I was experiencing were consistent with a small number of substances. Most of them were benign. Chamomile in high doses could cause drowsiness. Valerian was a common sleep supplement. But the quality of my fogginess was not the soft drowsiness of chamomile. It was thicker than that. Slower. More persistent. And on the mornings when I was most affected, I had noticed something else. A very slight tremor in my hands, gone by midday, but there in the mornings. I had noticed it 3 times now. I thought about this for a long time. I thought about it in the way I thought about drug interactions, systematically, without emotion, with the understanding that emotion would cloud the analysis and I could not afford clouded analysis. I thought about who in this house might have a reason to want me foggy. I thought about the conversations I had overheard, the particular quality of Candace's pleasantness, the way Marcus had looked at me in the kitchen that morning. I thought about the word incompetent, which no one had used yet but which hung in the air of certain conversations like a word someone was saving for the right moment. I thought about my house. I thought about what the house was worth. I had never refinanced after Gerald died. The mortgage was paid off years ago. The property value in this neighborhood, with its oak trees and its schools and its proximity to the city center, had increased substantially in the past decade. I had not thought about this in any particular way since Gerald died, because thinking about the value of a house you intend to live in until you die is not something you spend much time on. But someone else might think about it. Someone with a spreadsheet and a planner and a way of looking at you that was pleasant without quite being fond. And then I thought, am I being too suspicious? Am I constructing a narrative out of ordinary things? An herbal tea, some sleepy mornings, an overheard conversation? I am a pharmacist. I know what evidence looks like. And I know what it feels like to find it. I went to the pantry the next afternoon while Candace was at work and Marcus was on a call in his office upstairs. I took the tin from the shelf and opened it. I took a small amount of the blend, perhaps half a teaspoon, in a folded piece of wax paper, sealed it, and put it in the small zippered pocket of my purse. Then I replaced the tin exactly as I had found it. The next day I drove to see Eleanor. Eleanor Marsh had been my closest friend since we trained together at Penn State's pharmacy program in 1977. She had retired 3 years before I did, and she now spent her considerable intelligence on her garden, her grandchildren, and the comprehensive pharmacological reference library she kept in her sunroom because, as she liked to say, you never stop needing to know things. She was 73 and sharp as surgical steel, and she had never once in 46 years told me something I did not need to hear. I had not told her about my situation before this. I had been protecting Marcus, I think. Or protecting some version of the story I was still hoping would turn out to be the true one. I sat at Eleanor's kitchen table with the wax paper packet in front of me, and I told her everything. I told her about the tea and the sleep and the mornings and the tremor and the conversations I had half overheard, and the way my son looked at me when he thought I was not watching. I told her about the house and what it was worth and the word incompetent, that no one had said yet but that I felt approaching like weather. Eleanor listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about her. When I finished, she sat for a moment looking at the wax paper packet, and then she looked at me with the expression she reserved for situations that required a particular quality of seriousness. "Leave that with me," she said. "Eleanor, you know I still have access to an analysis lab through the university extension program." She picked up the packet. "Give me a week. And Miriam, don't drink the tea." I did not drink the tea that night. I poured it down the bathroom sink while the shower was running, and I set the empty cup back on my side table, and when Candace asked the next morning how I had slept, I said, "Beautifully, thank you." She smiled. She wrote something on the notepad she kept on the kitchen counter. I noted that also. I want to pause here and tell you something about the particular quality of that week. About what it is like to live in a house with people who do not know that you know. It is not comfortable. It is not a feeling I would recommend. But it is clarifying in a way that very little in life is clarifying, because it strips the situation of everything optional. There is no ambiguity left. There is only what is true and what is not true, and you know which is which, and the knowing is a form of power even when it does not feel like one. I continued my routines. I made my coffee in the mornings. I did my crossword puzzles. I called my friend Rosanna and we talked for an hour about her sister's retirement party. I emailed a former colleague at the hospital about a clinical question he had sent me, because I still consulted occasionally and I had not told Marcus or Candace this, because there are things you do not tell people who are trying to convince others that you are diminished. I watched Candace. I watched her carefully, in the way I had learned to watch during 34 years of patient counseling. Not staring, not obvious, but present in a way that registered everything. I watched the way she moved through the kitchen. I watched her make the tea each evening, the way she set the small tin on the counter, the way she measured the blend, the way she sometimes added something from a smaller container she kept in the back of the spice cabinet behind a row of other jars. A small amber glass bottle. I had seen it before and not registered it as anything significant. I registered it now. On the fourth night of not drinking the tea, I woke at 2 in the morning fully alert, which had not happened since before November, and I lay in the dark thinking about the amber glass bottle and what might be in it, and I felt the particular cold clarity of someone who has decided that the time for gathering information is nearly over. Eleanor called me on a Friday morning, 8 days after I had brought her the wax paper packet. I was in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store when she called, because I had developed the habit of having private conversations in my car, which was the one place in the house where I could be certain of not being overheard. "Miriam," she said, "are you somewhere you can talk?" "I'm in my car," I said. "Tell me." There was a pause. Eleanor is not a person who pauses unnecessarily. "The blend itself is innocuous," she said. "Chamomile, lemon balm, passion flower. Standard sleep blend, nothing concerning." "But," I said. "But the sample also contained traces of something else. A plant-derived compound. Kava extract. A specific form of it. Not the standard commercial preparation. In the concentration present in the sample, and taken nightly, it would produce exactly the symptoms you described. Sedation, cognitive dulling the following morning, hand tremor in some individuals. It is not dangerous at this dose, Miriam, but it is." She stopped. "It is deliberate," I said. "Yes," she said. "It is deliberate. And it is something a person would need to know to source specifically. This is not something you find in a grocery store." I sat with this for a moment. Outside my car, a woman was loading bags into a minivan. A child on a bicycle went past. The world continued as it was, ordinary and indifferent, while I sat inside mine and let the confirmation settle into the place where I had been holding the possibility open. "Thank you, Eleanor," I said. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to think," I said. "Miriam." "I've been thinking," I said. "I'm almost done thinking. Now I need to decide." I drove home. I made lunch. I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and wrote down everything I knew in the order in which I knew it, the way I would have written a patient file, factual and complete. Then I sat for a long time with my hands around my coffee cup, and I thought about my son. I thought about Marcus as a child, about the particular serious quality he had even at 6 years old, the way he would sit at the kitchen table and work through a problem until it resolved. I thought about how much of himself he had been before Candace, and how much of that self was still there, and how much had been smoothed away by proximity to someone who preferred things smoothed. I thought about whether he knew, whether Candace had told him or whether he had asked or whether he had simply watched and allowed it, the way he had allowed other things to be smoothed away. I thought about this for a long time. Then I stopped thinking about it because thinking about it was not the same as doing something about it, and I was done with the season of simply enduring. I was done with the cold tea and the efficient pleasantness and the word incompetent waiting in the air for its moment. I was done being arranged around. I was done being the problem that needed a solution someone else was designing. I had spent 34 years knowing what things were made of. I knew what this was made of now. And I had been in this profession long enough to know that when you identify a substance that is affecting someone without their knowledge, the next step is not confrontation. The next step is control. You control the exposure. You document. And then you determine the appropriate intervention. I was a pharmacist. I had spent my entire career intervening at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right information, to prevent exactly the kind of harm that comes from people not knowing what they are putting into someone else's body. I was going to intervene. But not yet. Not before I knew the full shape of what was happening. Not before I had everything I needed. The question was not whether Candace was adding something to my tea without my knowledge. That was no longer a question. The question was why, and what came next, and who else knew, and what was being planned in the quiet spaces of my own house while I sat in my chair with a cup of cold tea and pretended not to notice anything at all. I thought about the amber glass bottle in the back of the spice cabinet. I thought about the conversations I had not quite been able to hear through the bedroom door. I thought about my son and the way he had looked at me in the kitchen that Tuesday morning, that look I had not been able to read at first and then had read too well. I picked up my phone and I called my attorney, a woman named Patricia Holloway who had drafted Gerald's will, and who I had not spoken to in 2 years because there had been no reason to. I told her I needed to come in. I told her it was time sensitive. She said she could see me Monday morning. I said that would be fine. Then I set my phone down and I opened the kitchen cupboard and I took out the large pot and I started making soup because I had always made soup when I needed to think and I had a great deal more thinking to do. That evening, Candace made dinner. She set the table with the quiet efficiency she brought to everything. She served the meal. She poured the wine. She talked about a project at work with the particular quality of someone who was performing normalcy, and Marcus talked about the flight he had coming up at the end of the week. And I ate my dinner and said the appropriate things at the appropriate moments and watched them both across the table in the candlelight. The tea appeared on my side table at 8 o'clock. I thanked Candace for it. She smiled. I watched her go back to the kitchen, and then I waited until I heard the television come on in the living room, and I took the tea and I went to my bathroom and I poured it into the sink. And then I came back and I sat in my chair and I read my book and I felt, for the first time in months, entirely completely awake. That night I slept the way I used to sleep, lightly and in layers, waking briefly twice and knowing exactly where I was. And in the morning I rose early and made my coffee before anyone else was up and I sat at the kitchen table in the pale winter light and I thought about what I was going to do. If this story is already finding its way under your skin, hit that like button and subscribe to Sarah Mitchell. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. She always said the ones who stay quiet longest know the most. Let's see if that's true. I had been letting Candace pour that tea down my throat every evening for months. I had been waking foggy and moving slowly and sitting with my crossword half finished while somewhere in the back of the house my daughter-in-law noted whatever she was noting on her notepad, and my son returned from his trips and looked at me with that expression I had finally learned to read. I thought about the meeting I had scheduled with Patricia Holloway for Monday. I thought about what I would say to her, and what I would ask for, and what I needed in place before I made a single visible move. Then I heard Candace's alarm go off down the hall, and the soft thump of footsteps and the sound of the shower, and I got up and poured my coffee and started making eggs. And when they came into the kitchen I was there at the stove and I turned around and said good morning to both of them and I smiled and I meant none of it and all of it at once, the way you smile when you are standing on ground that only you know is solid. Marcus looked at me that morning with something I almost could not stand to see. Relief. He looked at me with relief, the way you look at someone who has been diminished enough to be managed, the way you look at a situation that is finally resolving the way you planned. I thought, how long has this been planned? I thought, I am going to find out. I was a pharmacist for 34 years. I knew what kava extract did to the human body. I knew its mechanism of action. I knew its half-life. I knew that it was a plant compound legal, available through specialty suppliers, and utterly traceable if you knew what to look for and who to ask. I also knew, with the particular awful clarity of someone who has been a professional for 3 decades, that a person who was adding a sedating compound to another person's food without that person's knowledge was not doing so casually. They were not doing it thoughtlessly. It required sourcing. It required dosing. It required the kind of sustained, purposeful effort that only comes from intention. The question I had been turning over all week, the question beneath all the other questions, was this. What did Candace intend to do with a mother-in-law who seemed to be getting forgetful, who woke foggy, who sat at the kitchen table in her robe at 11 in the morning, who had a hand tremor her son had noticed once and would notice again? I knew the answer. I had known the answer for a while. I had just been giving myself time to accept it. She intended to document it. She intended to make it real or real enough, and then she intended to use it. Petition. A medical evaluation. A conversation with Marcus about what was best for Mom, about how living alone in that house would not be safe, about the need for a supervised environment, about what the house might be worth and how that could fund very good care. I had seen this shape before. Not personally, not in my own life, but in the lives of patients whose families had called the pharmacy asking about their medications, asking how long certain things took to take effect, asking questions that were a little too specific and a little too purposeful. I had always been careful in those calls. I had always noted them. I had, twice in my career, reported concerns to the appropriate agencies. It had never occurred to me that someone would need to report a concern about me. It was occurring to me now. On Sunday, the day before my appointment with Patricia Holloway, Marcus was home. He was in his office for most of the morning, and Candace went to the grocery store, and I was alone in the house with my son for the first time in a very long time. I went to his office doorway. He was at his computer, not working, just scrolling, and he looked up when I appeared and said, "Hey, Mom," with the easy warmth he used when he was not being careful, And for a moment I saw him, the real Marcus, the one who had his father's eyes and his father's humor, the one who loved me without strategy. "Do you have a few minutes?" I asked. "Of course." I did not sit down. I stood in the doorway, which was intentional because standing is a posture of agency and I needed every posture of agency I could manage. "I want to ask you something," I said. "And I want you to think carefully before you answer." He looked at me. He was already being careful, I could see it closing over him, the careful version. "When did you start worrying about my cognitive health?" I asked. He blinked. "Mom, I don't." "Marcus." I said it the way I had said it when he was 16 and trying to tell me he had not been drinking at Brian Whitmore's party. "When did you start worrying? Not whether you're worrying. I know you're worrying. I know what worrying about me looks like on your face. I want to know when it started." There was a long silence. Outside a car passed. The house ticked quietly around us. "A few months ago," he said finally. "And what made you start?" Another silence. Longer this time. "Candace mentioned." He stopped. "She was worried. She said you seemed confused sometimes. That you were forgetting things." "What things?" "She said you left the stove on twice. That you couldn't remember a conversation you'd had." I looked at him. "Marcus," I said. "I have not left the stove on." He looked at me, and for a moment I could see the thing happening behind his eyes that happens to people when two realities they have been holding separately begin to shift toward each other. "I haven't been confused," I said. "I have been tired in the mornings. You've seen it. You've been concerned about it. And I understand why you've been concerned. But I want you to know that I'm going to talk to my doctor about it this week. And I'm going to find out exactly what's causing it. Because I would like to know what's in the tea your wife makes me every evening." The silence that followed that sentence was of an entirely different quality than the silences before it. Marcus's face did something complicated. Very complicated. I did not help him with it. I had done enough helping. I stood in the doorway and I let the silence do its work. And I watched my son sit with the thing he had been not quite looking at for months, and I waited. "Mom," he said. His voice had changed. Something in it had dropped, the way a thing drops when the weight of it becomes too much to carry at the height you've been carrying it. "I don't." He stopped. "Tried again." "I didn't know." "About the tea." "I didn't." "I know," I said. "I did not know. I was not certain. But I said it because it was the charitable possibility, and because I needed Marcus on one particular side of what was coming, and because I had spent 46 years believing in the people I loved until the evidence made belief impossible. The evidence about Marcus was not yet impossible. "I have an appointment Monday morning," I said. "With Patricia Holloway." He knew who that was. His face changed again. "I'm not angry with you," I said. And this was true, or mostly true, in the way that things are true when you have set the anger aside on purpose because it is not useful yet. "But things are going to change." I left him in his office. I went to my room and I called Eleanor and I told her what I had said and what Marcus had said and what I had not said. And Eleanor listened and then said in her precise and unsentimental way, "Good. Now get some sleep. You have a big week." I slept that night without the tea, without the fog, without anything between me and my own consciousness. And in the morning I woke clear and early and made myself coffee and sat in the kitchen while the house was still quiet and thought about Gerald. Gerald would have found this funny, in the dark way he found difficult things funny. He would have said, "Miriam, you spent 30 years catching people tampering with medications and you didn't see this coming?" And then he would have said more quietly, "What do you need? What's the first step?" The first step was Patricia Holloway. The second step was the amber glass bottle in the back of the spice cabinet. The third step, and this was the one I had been thinking about most carefully, most precisely, the one I had been building towards since the Friday Eleanor had called me from her sunroom and said the word deliberate. The third step was the moment when Candace placed the tea in front of me, and I had to decide what to do with it. I had been pouring it down the sink. I had been removing the exposure. But removing exposure is not the same as documentation, and documentation was what I needed. I needed Candace to put the tea in front of me in a way that could be witnessed. I needed the contents of that tea to be tested with a proper chain of custody. I needed the kind of evidence that does not depend on my word against hers. And I had an idea about how to get it. It was a small idea and a quiet one, and it required nothing more than patience and timing and the particular sleight of hand that comes from 34 years of handling small objects with precision. I had been a pharmacist. I knew how to switch things without anyone seeing. That Monday morning I drove to Patricia Holloway's office through a light January sleet. I was there for 2 hours. I told her everything: the tea, the compound, Eleanor's analysis, the conversations with Marcus, the pattern of fogginess and tremor, and the careful architecture of Candace's narrative about my declining competence. Patricia listened with a yellow legal pad in front of her and a pen she kept clicking shut and open, which was the only indication that anything I was saying was landing with particular force. At the end she set the pen down. "You understand," she said, "that if what you're describing is accurate, we are talking about more than a domestic dispute." "I understand," I said. "Administering a substance to another person without their knowledge or consent is a criminal matter in Pennsylvania. Depending on intent and outcome, it can rise to assault." "I know. You'll need the second lab report, not just Eleanor's informal analysis, but a formal chain of custody test." She was already writing. "I want you to get me a formal sample, and I want you to document every instance of the tea being given to you, every time you've poured it out, and any time you've observed Candace adding the additional ingredient." "I've been keeping notes," I said. "Time-stamped. On my phone." Patricia looked at me over her reading glasses. "How long have you been keeping these notes?" "Since January 4th. She was quiet for a moment. "Miriam," she said, "you never stopped being a professional, did you?" "I never saw a reason to," I said. She finished writing. She explained what she was going to do and what I was going to do and what the sequence of events would look like, and she told me to call her the moment I had the formal sample in hand, and she told me that in the meantime I was to continue exactly as I had been. Quietly, carefully, without confrontation, without giving Candace any indication that anything had changed. "One more thing," she said. "Your house, it's in your name alone?" "It is." "Good. I want to put you in touch with an estate planning colleague of mine, just to make sure everything is structured appropriately, just as a precaution." "Of course," I said. I drove home through the sleet. The roads were not bad. I was a careful driver. I had always been a careful driver. Candace was home that evening. Marcus had left for a 2-day trip that morning. She made dinner. She made it with the same quiet efficiency she always brought to it, moving through the kitchen with her back to me while I sat at the table and read, and I watched her from the corner of my eye the way you watch something you have decided you are going to understand completely before you are done with it. Dinner was a grilled chicken with roasted vegetables. It was fine. We ate together and talked about very little, and she cleared the plates and I said I would wash up, which I did, and then I went to sit in my chair. At 8 o'clock the tea appeared on my side table. Candace set it down with the same easy gesture she always used, pleasant and attentive, the picture of a thoughtful daughter-in-law caring for an aging mother. She said, "Sleep well, Miriam," and she went back to the kitchen. I looked at the tea, and then I did something very simple. I picked it up and I carried it into the kitchen and I said to Candace, "I think I'll have mine a little cooler. Would you mind making yourself a cup? I hate drinking alone." She turned from the sink. For just a moment, a fraction of a second, something moved across her face. Then the pleasantness returned, smooth and practiced. "Of course," she said. "Give me a minute." I set my cup on the counter beside the kettle. I watched her take a second mug from the cabinet. I watched her reach for the tin on the second shelf. And while her back was turned, in the 3 seconds between one movement and the next, I switched the cups. I put hers in front of my usual spot. I put mine, the one she had already made, the one from my side table, the one with whatever was in it, on the counter by the kettle. Then I went back to my chair. Candace brought her cup to the table. She sat across from me with the easy posture of a woman who had just made herself tea in her own kitchen, and she talked about a podcast she had been listening to, and I said the appropriate things, and I held my cup and breathed the steam from it and did not drink. After 20 minutes I excused myself and went to my room, and I took the cup I had not drunk from, and I set it on my nightstand, and I sat on the edge of my bed and I felt the silence of the house around me, and I thought about Candace sitting in the living room with a cup of tea I had not tampered with and how nothing would happen to her because of it, because I am not a person who does things to people without their knowledge. I am a person who documents. In the morning I would take the cup to Eleanor. In the morning the chain of custody would begin. In the morning, everything would start to move in the direction it had been building toward since the first night the tea appeared on my side table, since the first foggy morning, since the first time Candace said something to a neighbor about how I was having a hard time, and Marcus came home and looked at me with that expression that meant the plan was progressing. I sat on the edge of my bed in the quiet house and I thought about Gerald, and I thought about the 31 years of living in these rooms, and I thought about what it meant to know what things were made of, to know it in your bones professionally and arguably, and to have that knowledge be the thing that saves you. I was 71 years old. I had raised a son, buried a husband, and compounded medications for 34 years without a single serious error. I was not diminished. I was not forgetful. I was not confused. I was angry in the cold and purposeful way I had learned to be angry across a long career. The way you are angry when something has been done wrong and you are the person who knows how to make it right. And I was just getting started. Eleanor answered on the second ring. It was 7:15 in the morning and the sleet from the night before had hardened into a thin crust of ice on the driveway and I had been awake since 5, sitting with my coffee and my thoughts in the sealed cup on my nightstand that I had transferred, very carefully, into a clean glass jar from the pantry. I had worn gloves doing it, latex exam gloves from the box I kept in my bathroom cabinet, a habit from 34 years of handling substances you did not want on your skin. Old habits do not leave you. They simply wait in the background until they are useful again. I have a sample, I said when Eleanor picked up. A proper one. Cup and contents sealed. I handled it with gloves. Bring it now, she said. No preamble. No good morning. This was why I had been friends with Eleanor Marsh for 46 years. I left a note on the kitchen counter that said I had gone for an early walk. I put on my coat and my boots and I carried the jar in my tote bag and I drove to Eleanor's house through streets that were icy and empty and pale with early light. She met me at the door in her bathrobe and her reading glasses, and she took the jar from me and held it up to the kitchen light the way you hold something up when you are looking at it with professional eyes. Good girl, she said, which was what Eleanor said when she meant well done and did not want to be sentimental about it. She had already spoken, she told me, to a former colleague at the university chemistry department, a woman who had done consulting work for legal cases before, and who understood chain of custody and would document everything properly. The sample would be analyzed and the results would be reportable. Not just credible in my own mind or in Eleanor's, but reportable. Usable. How long? I asked. She can do a preliminary by end of week. Full written analysis within 10 days. 10 days. I thought about 10 days. I thought about what could happen in 10 days if Candace decided to accelerate whatever timeline she was working from. I thought about Marcus coming back from his trip. I thought about the notepad on the kitchen counter and what had been written in it. Eleanor, I said, I need to know something. If someone were building a case for a guardianship petition for incapacity, how long does that typically take to file? Eleanor set the jar down. She looked at me. In Pennsylvania, an emergency guardianship petition can be filed and heard within days, if the petitioner can demonstrate immediate risk. She paused. You think they're close? I think they're not far, I said. She was quiet for a moment, her hands flat on the kitchen table, the jar between us. Then you don't have 10 days, she said. You have 5. Maybe less. I know. Call your attorney the moment you leave here. I already have a call scheduled for 9. Eleanor looked at me with the expression she used when something impressed her, and she did not want to show it too plainly. You planned this, she said. I've been planning it since January 4th, I said. I drove home before anyone was awake. I changed out of my coat. I made a second cup of coffee and I sat at the kitchen table and I waited the way I had learned to wait, not passively, not with dread, but with the still and focused attention of someone who is holding a position. Candace came downstairs at 7:45. She was dressed for the office already, efficient and unremarkable. She said good morning. She made her coffee. She looked at the kitchen counter, at the space where her notepad lived, and she looked at it for just a half-second longer than was natural, and then she made herself busy with her mug. How did you sleep? She asked. Very well, I said. The best I've slept in weeks, actually. She turned from the counter. There was something in the look she gave me, something measured, something recalibrating. Good, she said. That's good. She left for work at 8:15. I called Patricia Holloway at 9. I told her about the cup, the sample, Eleanor's colleague, the 10-day timeline compressed to 5. Patricia listened without interrupting, and then she said, "All right, here's what's going to happen today." And she told me. She had already been in contact with a colleague in the district attorney's office. Not a formal report yet, but a preliminary conversation, what lawyers call a heads-up. She had also spoken with the estate planning attorney, a woman named Sandra Webb who had been handling complex family property cases for 20 years. Sandra would call me that afternoon. We needed to put certain things in place immediately, certain legal structures that would ensure the house, the investments, and my legal autonomy were secure against any attempt to invoke guardianship proceedings, however framed. Can they do it? I asked. File a petition, I mean. Is there enough? Patricia was quiet for a moment, which was more concerning than if she had simply said no. They would need medical documentation, she said carefully. A physician's assessment or a report from a mental health professional. Has Marcus taken you to any appointments recently? Has anyone asked you to see a doctor? I thought. Marcus suggested I see my GP a few weeks ago. He made an appointment. I went. And Dr. Kapoor found nothing of concern. I have my notes from the appointment. I asked for a copy of his written assessment. You have it. I have it in a file folder with my other medical documents. Another pause, this one different in quality. Miriam, Patricia said, you have been preparing for this for longer than you've told me. I have been a professional for 34 years, I said. I know what documentation looks like. Can you bring me the entire file? Today if possible. I could and I did. I drove to Patricia's office at noon with a manila folder containing my GP's written assessment, Eleanor's preliminary notes, my own timestamp log from my phone printed in 12-point font on 16 pages, and a small notebook in which I had been keeping a handwritten record of every evening the tea had appeared, every morning I had woken foggy, and every instance I had observed Candace adding something from the amber glass bottle to the blend. Patricia took the folder. She held it for a moment the way Eleanor had held the jar, with a careful professional attention that meant she was reading more than just the contents. This is excellent, she said. This is very good, Miriam. I know, I said. When I came home that afternoon the house was empty. Marcus not back until tomorrow, Candace at the office until 6. I went to the spice cabinet. I took the amber glass bottle from the back of the shelf behind the turmeric and the cumin and the smoked paprika, and I photographed it from every angle with my phone. Then I did something I had been thinking about since Sunday night. I took a small amount of the bottle's contents, less than Eleanor's original sample, barely a quarter teaspoon, onto a folded piece of clean paper. I replaced the bottle exactly as I had found it. I sealed the paper in a small plastic bag, and labeled it with the date and time in my precise pharmacist's hand. Then I went to my room and I sat on the edge of my bed, and I thought about what Marcus would look like when he came home tomorrow. I thought about the conversation we had had on Sunday, the way his face had done its complicated thing. I thought about whether he had spoken to Candace since. I thought about whether Candace had said anything to him that had changed the arrangement between them, and I thought about the particular way that loyalty shifts in a marriage when one person has been doing something the other person did not know about, or told themselves they did not know about. I thought about my son. I loved Marcus. I want to be clear that I loved him throughout all of this, that the love was not conditional on his behavior and had not become conditional and would not become conditional. But love is not the same as trust, and trust is not the same as allowing someone to do something harmful to you because you love them. I had trusted Marcus and he had allowed something to be done in his proximity, perhaps with his knowledge, perhaps without it, perhaps with the particular willed not knowing that is its own form of participation. I did not know yet which it was. I intended to find out. He came home Thursday evening. Candace was in the kitchen making dinner. I was in my chair with a book I was genuinely reading. One of the gifts of no longer drinking the tea was that I could concentrate again, that the words on the page stayed where they were supposed to stay and the thoughts I was having between paragraphs were my own thoughts, unmuddied. Marcus came in and put his bag down and went to the kitchen and said something to Candace I couldn't hear, and there was a pause, and then the sound of a low exchange that lasted perhaps 30 seconds, and then he came into the living room and sat on the sofa across from me. Hey Mom. How was the trip? Fine. Productive. He put his hands on his knees. He was looking at me with an attention that was different from his usual attention, more direct, and underneath the directness something he was working out. "I talked to Candace," he said. I waited. I asked her about the tea. He said it evenly without inflection. He had practiced this sentence. "And she said it was just an herbal blend that she'd read about the sleep benefits for." He stopped. "Tried again. For older adults. Did she mention the additional ingredient?" The silence that followed was precise and revealing. "What additional ingredient?" he said. And his voice was careful in the way of someone who either genuinely does not know or is very committed to the performance of not knowing. I looked at my son. I had known him for 44 years. I had watched his face in every condition, asleep and frightened and heartbroken and proud and guilty. I knew what guilt looked like on Marcus's face. It looked like avoidance. He was not avoiding my eyes right now. He was meeting them with a steadiness that cost him something. He did not know about the kava. I was not entirely certain of this, but I was more certain than I had been before he sat down. And uncertainty resolved in favor of the charitable interpretation is still a form of wisdom, if it is applied carefully. "Marcus," I said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. And I need you not to say anything to Candace until after you've listened. Can you do that?" He looked at me. "Mom, can you do that?" A long moment. "Yes," he said. I told him. Not everything, not Patricia Holloway, not the full scope of what was already in motion. But I told him about the kava extract and Eleanor's analysis and what that compound does in the doses present in the sample. I told him about the fogginess and the tremor and the mornings he had come home to find me sitting at the table in my robe. I told him what those symptoms were caused by and what they were not caused by. I told him calmly and completely, the way I would have told a patient's family member about a medication interaction, without drama and without accusation, because drama was not useful and accusation was not yet the right tool. I watched Marcus while I told him. What I saw on his face during those 5 minutes was not the complicated thing I had watched when I mentioned the tea on Sunday. What I saw was simpler and worse. What I saw was a man understanding something he had been peripherally aware of for months and had not let himself look at directly, and the understanding arriving all at once, and the weight of it landing. When I finished he was quiet for a long time. "Mom," he said. "Just my name. Nothing after it. The way you say something when language stops being adequate." "I know," I said. I didn't know what was in it. I didn't ask." He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. "I saw you were foggy in the mornings and I thought," he stopped. "Candace said you were getting forgetful. That she was worried. She was very worried, she said it constantly and He stopped again. "You were worried too," I said. "I should have asked. I should have." He made a sound that was not quite a word. "Yes," I said. "You should have." I said it gently because it was true and because he knew it was true and because being hard about it served neither of us. "But you're going to need to think very carefully now about what you do next. Because what has been happening in this house is not something I can allow to continue. And I have taken steps to make sure it doesn't." He looked up at me. "What steps?" I told him about Patricia Holloway. I told him about Sandra Webb. I told him that the legal structures to protect my autonomy and my property were being put in place, and that if Candace or anyone else attempted to file any kind of petition regarding my competence, they would find that the documentation supporting such a petition was contradicted by a great deal of documentation supporting the contrary, including a formal laboratory analysis of the substance that had been causing my symptoms. I watched Marcus while I told him this too. He went through several expressions. Fear was one of them, fear for Candace, I think, or for himself, the particular fear of someone who has been standing in the wrong place and is only now understanding the geography. And then something else moved through his face, slower and more complicated, and I thought it might have been relief, not at what Candace had done, but at what I was. At finding out, in this particular terrible moment, that his mother was exactly who he had always believed she was before he had allowed someone to suggest otherwise. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know," I said. "I am so sorry, Mom." "I know." I stood up. I put my hand on his shoulder for a moment, just a moment, and then I went to the kitchen to make my own dinner, because I was hungry and I had earned the right to cook in my own kitchen at whatever hour I chose. Candace came into the kitchen 10 minutes later. She looked at me at the stove and she looked at Marcus, who had followed me in and was sitting at the table with his elbows on it and his face doing something she had not seen from him before. She looked between us. "Dinner's almost ready," she said. "I'm making my own," I said pleasantly. "Go ahead without me." The evening passed with a quality of controlled electricity. Candace and Marcus ate dinner and I ate mine at the counter, and the three of us moved through the kitchen in a pattern that looked almost normal from the outside but had been entirely rearranged. The tea appeared at 8 o'clock. Candace set it on my side table with the same easy gesture, and I thanked her for it, and she went to the living room, and I sat in my chair and looked at the cup and thought about Patricia Holloway and Sandra Webb and Eleanor's colleague in the chemistry department. I did not switch the cups this time. I did not need to. The sample was already sealed and labeled and in my nightstand drawer. What I needed now was for nothing to change, for the pattern to continue uninterrupted until everything that needed to be in place was in place. I picked up the cup. I carried it to the bathroom. I poured it down the sink. Then I came back and read my book, and the words stayed where they were supposed to be, and I understood every sentence, and I felt, sitting in my own chair in my own house with my own clear and unmuddied mind, the particular satisfaction of a woman who has been underestimated by someone who should have known better. If this story has found you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, so you never miss a new story from Sarah Mitchell. The best ones are still coming. And the people who watch to the end are exactly the ones who need to hear them. Sandra Webb called me on Friday morning. She was brisk and thorough in the way of someone who has been solving these specific problems for a long time and has stopped being surprised by any of them. We spoke for an hour. By the end of the call, I understood exactly what was being put in place and why and what it would mean. A revocable living trust for the house and the investment accounts, with me as trustee and Eleanor named as successor trustee. A durable power of attorney designating Eleanor in the event of genuine incapacity. Not Marcus, not Candace, Eleanor, who had known me for 46 years and who had a lab analysis on her kitchen table, and who would sooner have donated her pharmacological library to a bonfire than allow anyone to mischaracterize my competence. A healthcare directive that named my preferences with specificity, and named Eleanor again as healthcare proxy. "These documents will be signed and filed by Wednesday," Sandra said. "At that point, any attempt to seek guardianship over you would face a legal structure that would make it extraordinarily difficult and that would, in the course of any proceeding, raise substantial questions about the circumstances under which anyone would be motivated to pursue such a petition. Including the laboratory analysis," I said. "Including that, yes. Which brings me to something I need to ask you directly. Do you intend to pursue criminal charges?" I had been thinking about this. I had been thinking about it since the Friday Eleanor had said the word deliberate, since the Monday Patricia had said administering a substance without consent was a criminal matter. I had been turning it over and over with the thoroughness I brought to every decision that mattered. "I intend to keep that option available," I said. "I do not intend to make that decision today." "That's wise," Sandra said. "For now, the civil protections are the priority." I thought about Candace. I thought about her in the clinical way I was trying to hold all of this, without heat, without the grief that was waiting for me at the edge of the analysis, the grief about what had been done in my own kitchen by someone who called herself my daughter-in-law. I thought about what drove a person to do this. I thought about whether she had been afraid of something about Marcus, about her position, about the future, and whether fear excused any of it. It did not. Fear does not give you the right to sedate another person. Fear does not give you the right to build a false narrative about someone's mental capacity in order to remove them from their own home. I had seen what fear could do to people in 34 years of working with patients and families, and I had compassion for it in the abstract, and I would not allow it to be the explanation that made what happened acceptable. On Saturday, I called my granddaughter. Her name is Nadia. She is Marcus's daughter from his first marriage, 22 years old, a junior at Temple University studying political science. She had her grandfather's eyes, Gerald's eyes, which was the same as saying Marcus's eyes, which was sometimes startling to look at. She and I spoke every 2 weeks, regular as clockwork, and she was the only person in the family who still called me Grandma Miriam instead of Grandma, as though the name were a complete thing that needed both its parts. I had not told her any of this. I had protected her from it the way I had initially protected Eleanor and Patricia, out of the instinct not quite rational to keep the people you love outside the radius of a thing while you are still determining its full shape. But I called her Saturday morning because something Marcus had said had settled in me overnight like a pebble settling through water, and I needed to ask her about it. "Grandma Miriam," she said. "What's wrong? Why do you think something's wrong? You called on a Saturday. You never call on a Saturday. Saturday is your gardening day." I could not garden in January, but she was not wrong about the pattern. "I need to ask you something," I said. "Has your father said anything to you recently about my health? About being concerned about me?" Silence on the line. The particular silence of someone deciding something. "Nadia." "He texted me in November," she said. "He asked if I'd noticed anything different about you when I visited at Thanksgiving. He said Candace was worried." A pause. "I told him you seemed completely fine. I told him you corrected the waiter's description of the wine pairing and explained the tasting notes in more detail than I could follow, which is your normal." "What did he say?" "He said Candace thought you might be having good days and bad days. That you were good around company." She stopped. "Grandma Miriam, what is happening?" I told her. I told her more than I had told Marcus, because Nadia was not implicated in anything and because she was 22 and sharp, and I had always believed that sharp young women deserve to be told the truth directly. I told her about the tea and the compound and Eleanor's analysis and Patricia and Sandra Webb. I told her about the documents being prepared. I told her that by Wednesday everything legal would be in place, and that no one would be in a position to make decisions about my life or my house without my knowledge and consent. She was very quiet while I told her. When I finished, there was a pause that felt like held breath. "Grandma Miriam," she said. "My dad didn't. He didn't know what was in the tea?" "I don't believe he knew about the kava," I said. "I believe he was being given a narrative about my competence, and he found it easier to accept that narrative than to examine it. That's also a thing he did wrong." "Yes," I said. "It is. But Candace is a separate matter," I said. "And it will be handled as a separate matter." Another pause. "Are you okay?" she asked. Not the automatic okay, not the performative okay, but the real question, asked in the voice she had learned from Gerald. "I am," I said. And this was true. I have been more awake in the past 2 weeks than I have been in months. Which is perhaps not surprising, given the circumstances. She almost laughed. Then she didn't. "I'm coming up," she said. "Next weekend. I'm coming to see you." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to. And also," she said with a precision I recognized as mine, transplanted a generation forward, "I think it would be useful for certain people to see that you have people coming to see you. That you have a family that is paying attention." "Nadia," I said. "What?" "You have your grandfather's eyes and your great-aunt Dorothy's mind, and I am very glad you exist." She was quiet for a moment. "I love you, Grandma Miriam." "I love you too," I said. "Now let me know what train you're taking." On Sunday, Marcus asked if we could talk. We sat in the living room, the two of us, in the mid-morning light. Candace was upstairs. The house was quiet. Marcus sat with his hands together between his knees, which was what he did when he was uncomfortable and not going to pretend otherwise. "I've been thinking," he said, "about everything you told me Thursday. I expected you to think about it. I talked to Candace. I waited. I asked her directly what was in the tea." He looked at the floor. "She said it was chamomile and lemon balm and passion flower. She said she hadn't added anything else. She said you were. She said you might be confused about it. The old narrative. Even now, even with the floor shifting, the old narrative." "Marcus," I said. "I know." He pressed his lips together. "I know. I'm not saying I believe her. I'm saying she said it." He looked at me. "She's scared, I think. She's scared of what you..." He stopped. "She thinks you're trying to..." "I'm not trying to anything," I said. "I am protecting myself. Those are different things." He was quiet for a moment. "I know they're different," he said. "I do." He looked at his hands. "I've been thinking about November. About why I called you, why I asked you to let us move in, and whether..." He stopped again. "Whether it was for my benefit or for yours," I said. He looked up. "I've been thinking about that too," I said. "And I think the honest answer is that it was both. I think you genuinely wanted to help, and I think Candace had a plan, And I think those two things traveled together for long enough that you stopped examining whether they were actually the same thing. He did not argue with this. I'm not asking you to choose between your wife and your mother, I said. I want to be clear about that. What happens between you and Candace is your marriage and your decision. But what happens to me, in this house in my life, is mine. I know, he said. The documents Sandra Webb is preparing will make that legal as well as true, I said. And I need you to understand that they are happening regardless of what Candace says or how she responds. This is not a negotiation. He nodded. He was still looking at his hands. Marcus, I said. Look at me. He looked at me. I am your mother, I said. I am not a problem. I am not a situation. I am not a person who needs to be managed or maintained or quietly repositioned while more convenient arrangements are made. I am a 71-year-old woman with a pharmacology degree and 34 years of professional practice, and I know exactly what has been happening in this house, and I need you to know that I know. Something crossed his face. Something that had been held at a distance maybe for months arrived. I'm sorry, he said. And this time it was different from Thursday's apology, not the reflexive sorry of someone who has just heard bad news, but the considered sorry of someone who has been sitting with the understanding of what they allowed. I'm sorry, Mom. I looked at my son. I looked at Gerald's eyes looking back at me from a different face. I know, I said. The rest of Sunday passed the way Sundays do when something large has shifted but nothing has yet visibly changed. Candace made lunch. She was pleasant at the table. She was efficient. She looked at me once or twice with a quality of attention I had not seen from her before. Not the assessing look of someone who was documenting, but something more uncertain. Something that was perhaps the first edges of understanding that the ground had moved. The tea appeared at 8 o'clock. I thanked her for it. I took it to the bathroom. I poured it down the sink. I came back and I read until 10 and then I went to bed, and I lay in the dark and I thought about Wednesday. About Sandra Webb's office. About the documents that would be signed and the structures that would be in place. About Eleanor's colleague in the chemistry department, and the analysis that would be in Patricia Holloway's hands by end of week. I thought about Candace and what came next for her, and I allowed myself to feel, briefly, privately, the grief of it. The grief of a woman who had wanted a daughter, and had gotten something else instead. The grief of a family that had been bent out of its true shape by fear and convenience, and the small accumulating decisions that lead to an amber glass bottle in the back of a spice cabinet. I let the grief move through me and I did not stop it and I did not amplify it. Then I set it aside. Because grief was for later, for the season after this one, for the long winter evenings when everything was resolved and I was sitting in my chair in my own house with my own tea, herbal and harmless and made by my own hands, and I had the space and the quiet to feel all the things I had been putting aside in order to remain clear. Right now, clarity was the work. And the work was almost done. Wednesday came with clear skies. I noticed this the way I noticed everything now, with the full attention of someone who had been given her attention back. The light came through the bedroom window at an angle that turned the bare branches of the oak tree in the backyard into something architectural, precise and beautiful, and I lay in bed for a moment just looking at it, the way I had not allowed myself to simply lie and look at things in months. Then I got up. I made my coffee. I dressed carefully, not dramatically, not in a way that announced anything, but in the way I dressed when something mattered. A good wool blazer. My pearl earrings, the ones Gerald had given me on our 20th anniversary. My good boots. I looked at myself in the mirror the way I had not quite been able to look at myself since November, and the woman looking back at me was not foggy or diminished or in need of management. She was 71 years old and she had Gerald's respect and Eleanor's loyalty and Patricia Holloway's expertise and 34 years of knowing exactly what things were made of, and she was going downtown to sign documents that would make all of that official. Candace had already left for work. Marcus was in his office. I told him I had an errand and I would be back by noon, and he said okay, and I could feel him not asking where I was going because he had understood, somewhere in the long interior reckoning of the past several days, that the season of tracking my movements was over. Sandra Webb's office was on the third floor of a building downtown that smelled of carpet cleaner and old paper, and the particular quiet authority of a place where decisions are made in careful language. Her assistant offered me coffee. I accepted. I sat in the chair across from Sandra's desk and I read every document she placed in front of me, All of them, every page, every clause, the way you read things when you are a professional and you know that what is written is what is binding. The trust document. The power of attorney. The healthcare directive. The letter, already prepared for my signature, to be sent to Patricia Holloway for the purpose of formalizing the complaint that would accompany Eleanor's laboratory analysis when the final report arrived. I signed everything. My hand was steady. It had been steady for 2 weeks now, since I stopped drinking the tea, since the kava cleared my system completely and left me with nothing but my own ordinary 71-year-old hands, which were fine, which had always been fine. Sandra witnessed the signatures. Her assistant witnessed the signatures. Everything was notarized and dated, and the copies were made and the originals were filed. Sandra walked me through what happened next, the filing sequence, the notification requirements, the timeline for the laboratory reports incorporation into the formal record. "There is one more thing," she said, when we had gone through all of it. She folded her hands on her desk. "I want to be direct with you about something." "Please," I said. "The civil protections we've put in place today are comprehensive. No one can move against your autonomy or your property without going through a legal process that would now face substantial opposition." She looked at me steadily. "But the criminal question is still open. And I want you to think carefully about what you want from it. Not what you're entitled to. You're entitled to pursue it fully. But what you want. Because there's a difference." I had been thinking about this since January. Since the word deliberate. Since the afternoon I sat in my car in the grocery store parking lot with Eleanor's voice on the phone, and felt the floor of the situation settle into its true shape. "I want her to know that I know," I said. "Completely. Not as a suspicion I might have, not as a thing I'm perhaps confused about. I want her to know that the documentation exists, that the analysis exists, that every instance has been recorded, and that what she did has a name, and that name is something a prosecutor would use." Sandra nodded slowly. "And beyond that?" "Beyond that," I said, "I want my house. I want my life. I want my son, if there is anything left of the relationship worth wanting. And I want to never again have to wonder what is in something someone hands me in my own kitchen." Sandra was quiet for a moment. "That's a thoughtful answer," she said. "I've had time to think," I said. I drove home. The sky was still clear, that particular winter blue that is cold and absolute and beautiful. I stopped at a bakery I had not been to in months, a small place on Market Street that made the kind of almond croissants Gerald used to bring home on Saturday mornings, and I bought 2 and ate one in the car and felt the pleasure of it without guilt and without fog and without anyone noting anything about it on a notepad. When I came home, Marcus was no longer in his office. He was in the kitchen, sitting at the table, and Candace was across from him, and they were having a conversation that stopped when I came through the door. I looked at both of them. Candace looked at me with the expression I had been waiting to see on her face. Not pleasantness. Not the efficient management of an elder in the household. Something rawer than that. Something that had lost the protective layer of its performance. She looked like someone who had recently understood that the ground had moved, and was still working out where she was standing. "Miriam," she said. My name without the qualifier. Without the particular intonation of someone who is cataloging you. "Hello, Candace," I said.
I set mig bag dagen.
I put the remaining almond croissant on the counter. I took off my coat and hung it on the hook by the back door. And I turned around and looked at them both with the calm that had been building in me since January 4th. "I've just come from my attorney's office," I said. "I want you both to know that certain legal documents have been signed and filed today. Sandra Webb will be in contact with each of you in the next 48 hours with the relevant notifications." I looked at Candace. "Patricia Holloway will also be in contact with you, Candace, regarding a separate matter." Candace's face did something very complicated. "What separate matter?" Marcus said. "I think Candace understands what separate matter," I said. I kept my voice even. I kept it at the temperature of a professional conversation, because that was the only temperature at which I was going to be able to say these things without the grief getting into them, and the grief did not belong here yet. "I think she has understood for several days that something has changed, and that the documentation of what happened in this house exists, and is in the hands of people who know what to do with it." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside a car passed. The refrigerator hummed. Candace looked at the table. She looked at her hands. She said nothing, and the nothing was its own kind of answer. Not the silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the silence of someone who had too much to say and no version of it that helped her. "I'm not going to have this conversation today," I said. "There will be a time for conversation. There will be a time for all of it. But today I signed documents protecting my home and my legal autonomy, and today I ate an almond croissant in my car on Market Street, and today I am going to sit in my chair and read my book, and tomorrow Patricia Holloway will begin whatever she is going to begin." I looked at Marcus. "I would like you to be here this week. I would like you not to travel." "I won't," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Good," I said. I took my book and I went to my chair and I sat in the afternoon light and I opened to the page I had marked and I read for 2 hours without interruption, without fog, without the particular quality of heaviness that had been sitting on my thinking since November. I read with the full pleasure of a person whose mind belongs to herself. The tea appeared at 8 o'clock. I looked at it where it sat on my side table. I looked at the cup and the small coil of steam rising from it and I thought about all the evenings I had thanked Candace for this cup, all the evenings I had carried it to the bathroom, all the months of careful not knowing performed in plain sight. I left the cup on the table. I did not pick it up. I did not thank anyone for it. I simply turned the page of my book and continued reading. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be said. The laboratory report arrived on the following Monday. Eleanor called me at 8:30 in the morning with the formal results from her colleague at the university, and the results were exactly what I had known they would be. Precise and documented and chain of custody verified and containing the specific identification of kava extract, a non-standard preparation, present in a concentration consistent with intentional dosing. The report named the compound and its properties and its expected physiological effects at the identified concentration, and it was signed and dated by someone with more letters after her name than room to print them. I called Patricia Holloway. Patricia had been in contact with the district attorney's office once more. A more formal conversation this time, with the preliminary evidence already in hand. The laboratory report completed the picture. Patricia told me what the next steps looked like, what the timeline was, what my options were at each stage of the process. She told me that my own records, the 16 pages of timestamp notes, the photographs of the amber glass bottle, the observations logged since January 4th, were, in the context of the laboratory report, unusually thorough documentation. "Most people," she said, "don't document like this." "Most people," I said, "are not pharmacists." There was a pause on the line, and then Patricia said something I was not expecting. "Miriam," she said, "I want you to know that what you did, the way you handled this, the patience of it, the precision, it is not typical. What you had was a case that could very easily have been dismantled. Symptoms explained away, documentation called circumstantial, the credibility of a 71-year-old woman set against the word of a younger one. You made it impossible to dismiss. You did that. I spent 34 years learning to make things impossible to dismiss," I said. "Well," she said, "it shows." The conversation with Candace happened on a Thursday afternoon, 8 days after I had returned from Sandra Webb's office. Marcus was there. Nadia was there. She had come up the weekend before as she had promised, and she had stayed, sleeping in the guest room, appearing each morning at the kitchen table with her laptop and her coffee and her grandfather's eyes watching everything with the particular alertness of someone who is not going to miss anything. Candace had received the notification from Patricia Holloway on Tuesday. I did not know what the notification said exactly, but I knew what it contained in substance. A description of the evidence, a statement of what could be pursued, an invitation to respond through counsel. Candace had retained an attorney of her own. The attorney had apparently advised her, correctly I thought, it was the advice I would have given, to speak with me before anything went further. We sat in the living room. All four of us. The afternoon light was the same winter light that had been there all along, the same quality of cold clarity, and I sat in my chair and Marcus sat on the sofa and Nadia sat beside him and Candace sat across from me in the chair she had always taken at the dinner table, the one that faced the window. She looked different. She had looked different all week. The pleasantness was gone. Not replaced by anything hostile, simply gone, the way a performance ends when the audience knows what they are watching. What was left was a person I had not quite seen before, and she was younger looking without the performance, and she was frightened and she was, I thought, ashamed. I had thought about what I wanted to say for a long time. I had gone through many versions of it. The angry version, which would have felt satisfying for perhaps 30 seconds and useful for nothing. The cold professional version, which was the easiest to maintain but left no room for anything true. The version in which I simply stated facts and let her respond to them. I chose the version that was closest to who I actually was. I know what you did, I said. I know how long you did it. I know what you intended it to accomplish. I have documentation of all of it, and that documentation is now in the hands of people who know what to do with it. I looked at her. I am not asking whether you did it. I am not offering you the opportunity to deny it. I am telling you that I know. Candace looked at her hands. She had good hands, capable hands, the hands of someone organized and efficient. They were very still in her lap. I want to understand why, I said. Not to excuse it. Not because the why changes what happened or what it meant. But because I spent 34 years believing that people are more complicated than the worst thing they do. And I would like to give you the opportunity to show me that's still true. The room was very quiet. Marcus was looking at the floor. Nadia was watching Candace with an expression I recognized as my own careful attention transplanted into a 22-year-old face. Candace looked up. I was afraid, she said. Her voice was flat and direct, without the practiced pleasantness. The real voice underneath it. I was afraid of losing everything. She paused. Marcus talks about this house the way people talk about a place that belongs to them. And I thought, she stopped. I thought if something happened to you, if the house went to, if there were other arrangements, I thought we would. She stopped again. You thought the house would ensure your position, I said. She looked at me. Not flinching, not looking away. There was something almost like dignity in it, the dignity of a person who has stopped pretending. I thought a lot of things, she said. About what Marcus wanted. About what his family expected of him. About whether there was room for me in it. She looked down again. That doesn't make it right. No, I said. It doesn't. Silence. I was wrong, she said. What I did was wrong. I knew it was wrong while I was doing it. I told myself it wasn't harmful, that it was just that you would sleep better and I would have time to. She stopped. That doesn't make it right either. No, I said. It doesn't. I looked at her for a long moment. I looked at the woman who had reorganized my kitchen and moved my chair, and made me tea every evening for months and noted things on a notepad and spoken to neighbors about how I was having a hard time. I looked at her and I felt the grief of it. The grief I had been setting aside. The grief of a family that had been twisted by fear and ambition, and the particular cruelty that comes from treating someone as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be known. And I felt something else underneath the grief. Something I had not expected to feel, sitting in this room, on this particular Thursday afternoon. I felt sorry for her. Not forgiveness, that was a different country, a place you reached by a longer road. And I was not there yet and might not be for a long time. But sorry for her. Sorry for whoever she had been before she became frightened enough to do this. Sorry for the version of this marriage that might have existed if fear had not gotten into it, and made everything smaller and meaner than it needed to be. I'm not going to tell you what the consequences of this will be, I said. That is between you and your attorney and Patricia Holloway. But I want to tell you something, and I want you to listen carefully. She looked at me. I built this house, I said. Not the walls and the roof, those were built before we came. But the life inside it. Gerald and I built that. 31 years of it. Every meal cooked in that kitchen, every morning on the back porch, every rosebush planted along the front walk. This house is not an asset. It is not a vehicle for securing anyone's position. It is the place where I buried my husband's memory, and where I intend to live until I am done living. I looked at her steadily. I am not going anywhere. Not to a supervised facility. Not to any arrangement designed to convenience someone else. I am staying in my house. And anyone who lives in my house lives here as my guest, on terms I set, with the understanding that I am the one who is here by right. Candace did not say anything. That is not a punishment, I said. It is simply the truth, which perhaps should have been established more clearly from the beginning. Marcus made a sound. I looked at him. He was looking at the floor with the expression of a man who was sitting with something very heavy, and not trying to put it down. Marcus, I said. He looked up. I love you, I said. That is not in question and it is not going anywhere. But I need you to understand that what happened here happened in part because you allowed a narrative about me to be built without questioning it, and that narrative was intended to harm me. The harm was real. The fogginess was real. The tremor was real. Those mornings you came home and found me sitting at the table, those were real, and they were not what Candace said they were. He nodded. His jaw was tight. He was holding himself very carefully together. I need you to be my son, I said. Not my manager. Not my administrator. My son. I know, he said. Mom, I know. I'm sorry. I know you are, I said. Now let's talk about what happens next. What happened next was complicated in the way that real things are complicated, which is to say it was not a single moment of resolution but a series of smaller moments accumulating over weeks into something that began to look slowly like change. The formal process with Patricia Holloway moved at its own pace. Candace's attorney negotiated. There were conversations I was not part of and decisions that were not mine to make. I had set the documentation in motion and I had stated what I wanted, the protection of my autonomy, the acknowledgement of what had been done, the assurance that it would not happen again, and I left the mechanism of it in the hands of people who understood the mechanism better than I did. That is what you do when you have chosen your professionals carefully. You trust the process you built. Nadia stayed for 2 weeks. She ate breakfast at my kitchen table every morning and she talked to me about her political science coursework and about a professor she admired and about a boy she was almost certain she liked but wasn't entirely sure, and I listened to all of it with the full attention of someone who had been given her attention back, and I thought about how much I had missed, sitting in my foggy mornings carrying cups to the bathroom sink, existing in the diminished version of myself that the kava had constructed, and I was angry about that in the cold and purposeful way. And I was also glad in a way that was almost physical that it was over. She hugged me when she left, standing on the front walk by the rosebushes, which were bare and thorned and dormant in the February cold. You're the most impressive person I know, she said into my shoulder. You're 22, I said. You don't know very many people yet. She pulled back and looked at me with Gerald's eyes. I know enough, she said. I stood on the front walk and watched her car until it turned the corner. And then I stood there a moment longer in the cold, looking at the rosebushes. I had planted them in 1997, 6 of them along the whole length of the front walk, and they came back every spring without much help from me, stubborn and reliable and quietly beautiful in the way of things that do not make a performance of their endurance. In March, Marcus and Candace moved out. This was not my decision or not entirely. It was the accumulated decision of everything that had happened, the weight of it pressing on the marriage until it produced its own resolution. I was not involved in whatever conversations happened between them. I had no particular position on whether they stayed together or separated. That was their life, their marriage, and I had enough of my own life to attend to without making a project of theirs. What I knew was that on a Saturday morning in early March, a moving company came and packed the things that belonged to them and moved them to an apartment in the city that Marcus had taken a lease on. Candace was there and Marcus was there. And the movers were efficient and impersonal, and I sat in the kitchen and made my own tea from a blend I had chosen myself from a tin with a label I could read, and I watched through the kitchen window as the boxes went into the truck. Marcus came to find me when the truck was loaded. He stood in the kitchen doorway the way he had stood in that other doorway on that Sunday, the one where we had our first real conversation about all of it. He looked tired. He had been looking tired for weeks. He also looked underneath the tiredness like himself, the self that existed before the layers of managed silence, the self that had his father's eyes and his father's humor and a fundamental decency that had been badly misdirected for longer than either of us wanted to calculate. I'll call, he said. Please do, I said. He stood for a moment longer. Mom, he said. I looked at him. I don't have a version of the last few years that makes me look okay, he said. I've been trying to find one and I can't. That's all right, I said. You don't need one. You need to know what you're going to do differently. He looked at me. I'm working on that, he said. Good, I said. That's all I need you to do. He crossed the kitchen and he hugged me, and I hugged him back the way I had hugged him when he was small, without reservation, without accounting for everything that was wrong, just with the simple fact of loving him, which was not complicated even when everything else was. Then he picked up his bag and he walked out to the truck. And I heard the truck pull away, and the house was quiet. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment. The morning light came through the window at the angle it always came through in March, a little warmer than February, a little more sure of itself. The rose bushes would be showing the first small nodes of growth by now, the ones that would be leaves in 6 weeks and then flowers in June, red and full and completely indifferent to whatever had happened inside the house they bordered. I made a fresh cup of tea. My own tea from my own tin, steeped exactly as long as I wanted it steeped. I took it to my chair by the window and I sat down and I looked at the front walk and the rose bushes and the oak trees lining the street and the ordinary beautiful unremarkable fact of a March morning in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And I thought about Gerald, and I thought about 31 years in this house, and I thought about the amber glass bottle which had been taken by Patricia Holloway's contact months ago, and which was now someone else's evidence in someone else's filing system. I thought about what it meant to know what things were made of. Not just compounds and substances and mechanisms of action, though I knew those too, would always know those 34 years of knowing do not leave you. But what things were made of at the larger scale. What a marriage was made of. What a family was made of. What the quiet daily life of a woman in her own house was made of, and what it was worth and what it cost to protect it, and what you were left with when you had. You were left with this. With morning light and your own tea and the rose bushes coming back as they always came back. With a granddaughter who had her grandfather's eyes and would be calling on Saturday. With an old friend in a sunroom full of pharmacological references who answered on the second ring. With 34 years of professional knowledge that had turned out to be exactly the right tool for exactly this moment, which perhaps should not have surprised anyone, least of all me. With yourself intact and clear-eyed and entirely completely awake. I took a long slow sip of my tea. It tasted like chamomile and lemon and nothing else. Tasted like exactly what it was. Outside, a cardinal landed in the bare oak tree at the edge of the front walk, brilliant red against the pale March sky, impossibly vivid, the kind of thing you notice when your attention belongs to you again. I watched it for a long time. It stayed longer than birds usually stayed, as though it had nowhere else to be, as though this branch in this tree in front of this house were exactly the right place. Gerald used to say that when you saw a cardinal, it was someone coming to check on you. I thought, I'm all right. I want you to know. I'm all right. The cardinal sat in the oak tree for another long moment, red and precise and perfectly still, and then it lifted away into the pale sky and was gone. I turned back to my window, picked up my book. I found my page. I read. Thank you for staying all the way to the end. The people who finish the whole story are the ones who understand it, and the ones who share it. If this one moved you, the next video on your screen is waiting to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come back. There's always another woman the world underestimated. And we tell those stories here.